Hello and welcome to another lesson in the increasingly regrettably named Theory Zone. This Theory Zone lesson is based on representations and specifically Judith Butler's queer theory. This is a theory about gender and representations of gender. The aims of this session are to know differing theories of approaches towards ideas of gender, and of course throughout the session you'll be encouraged to think about and explore how these ideas can be applied to our set media products, whereas we'll look at some others as well. So first of all, a bit of a starter question really. Why is the media, and therefore media studies, so obsessed with ideas surrounding gender? Why does it seem to be the zeitgeist? Why does it seem to be something that will come up in every single course? And in fact, if we look at our own course, 3 of the theories that we look at in representation are gender related. So why is this? A couple of hints to get you thinking, or a couple of prompts if you like. Think about historical context. Is that important? Or is it because of our current political outlooks that gender is such an important part of the study? And also, does it reflect the different uses we have of the media and various platforms? So in other words, how does this relate to us as an audience and the convergence of different media industries as well? So why is the media, and therefore media studies, so obsessed with ideas surrounding gender? Now, I imagine the most common answer that you've put in there or talked about is representation. Of course, we have always studied representation of gender since media was a young subject, since we've looked at the analysis of film, TV, newspapers, advertising. Gender has always been an issue, as has the notion of stereotyping. So I'm sure a few of you have talked about the idea of stereotyping within the media. Perhaps you've discussed underrepresentation. Perhaps you've talked about misrepresentation. But that's the key element I imagine we've talked about. And of course, historical context does play a part because our attitudes in society have changed towards gender. You'll probably see that whatever you study, that some of the issues raised in this lesson can be related to that particular subject that you study outside of media. Most commonly psychology, sociology, English, but even subjects such as law will probably have a connection to this lesson in particular. Of course, as we think more and more about the audience, our own gender identity and our own understanding of gender evolves, and of course that affects how we consume the media as well. So it's a complex set of issues. I think some of the ideas that I'm going to be telling you about in this session aren't things that you'll necessarily agree with, some that you might disagree with, but I'm just taking you through a session telling you the ideas of a theorist, a specific theorist, and then how we can apply those to media studies. And the difficult thing with any issue surrounding not just gender but any kind of media studies issue is that sometimes we have to define our terms to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. So I just want to give a couple of definitions of terms for the purposes of this lesson. You may disagree with the way those terms are defined, but as long as we're all on the same page with this, we should be able to get through the lesson with a similar understanding. So first of all, the word gender itself. In this instance, for this lesson, we will be defining gender as the socially constructed roles and relationships of men and women. Okay, so looking at gender as the social construct, to do with roles and to do with relationships. Okay, and we're going to define this quite starkly or differently from the word sex. And what we mean by sex in the case of this, or for the purposes of this lesson, is those biological characteristics which define humans as either female or male. Okay, so we're making a distinction between gender, which we see as the roles and relationships of men and women, and sex as the biological differences. Okay, and some of those are physical, and some of those are genetic. Then we get this term gender norms. Okay, and this is where maybe some of these sociological aspects come in. And what we mean by the term gender norms are the specific roles that are assigned to either sex that have formed and do evolve over time. So let me give you quite an old-fashioned example of a gender norm. Would be the idea that a woman may be expected to take control of domestic duties, okay? Someone who nests, shall we say, someone who works inside the home. Whilst, again, this is quite an old-fashioned example of a gender norm that still exists in some cultures and societies, the idea that men may be expected to provide financially, the breadwinner, working outside the home in relation to that hunter-gatherer evolutionary kind of idea. So they're gender norms, the things that are expected and are assigned to sexes, which obviously shapes gender. So just to reinforce that point, the terms male and female we'll use to refer to the biological differences between men and women. And we'll use the terms masculinity and femininity for the terms relating to social constructs. Again, you may have a differing understanding of this, or you might come to this using those terms slightly differently. But just for the sake of the lesson and making sure that we are all using the similar terms, we'll use male and female to talk about biological terms, and masculinity and femininity to talk about social constructs. In other words, male and female for sex, masculinity and femininity for gender. So to kind of get started on this, what I'd like you to do is just to make a list of typical masculine or feminine characteristics. Have a think about what the ideas that we consider to be typically masculine or typically feminine. Just to give you a sort of heads up, words that you might consider for masculine might be handsome, strong, tough. Okay, these are all ideas that are typically associated with masculinity. And femininity, maybe we use words like weak, delicate, pretty. So start making a list of words that that correspond to masculinity and femininity. What you may have found with your list is that there are a couple of things that happen. One thing that happens is that you end up with certain binary oppositions, that men are often described in terms that are the opposite of the terms that are used for women. So some of you may have had, for example, dominant for masculine, submissive for feminine, okay? And that's quite interesting for us to look at how language plays a part in the social construct of masculinity and femininity using series of binary oppositions. On the other hand, you may have found that you've used essentially synonyms for the same characteristic, just a very different word for those qualities. So a feminine word is sometimes bossy, whereas a masculine word is sometimes assertive. It's the same quality in both male and female, but we consider masculine version of that to be assertiveness and the feminine version of that to be bossiness. Of course, both of those come with different connotations. So it's again equally as interesting to see that we define masculinity and femininity not only by a series of binary oppositions, but when we assign the same qualities to them, we often have different words for essentially the same quality. What this also tells us, or what we can often find as well, is that ideas about what it means to be masculine and feminine vary between societies and change over time as well. So what I like to do is just think of some examples of both, really. First of all, can you think of examples of where masculinity and femininity has changed over time? And secondly, can you think of ideas of where ideas of masculinity and femininity are different in different cultures or society? Whilst I think you probably found quite a few of those, particularly when we look back in our recent history, and if you do study a subject like law or sociology, some of you might have mentioned aspects like the Sexual Discrimination Act, which came in 1975. If you study history, I'm sure you looked at the roles of women and possibly even the monarchy over that time as well. If you study something like geography or, again, sociology, you might have described different cultures and different societies that have very different opinions on patriarchal systems, or even societies which employ more matriarchal systems. So there are obvious differences between this, and to suggest that what we're looking at today covers the whole world is would be kind of quite absurd. But what I want to move on to next is looking at how we get our notions of gender, the elements throughout society that contribute to the construction of gender. So just take a moment to make a list of the different aspects you would say in your life and the life of others that do contribute to their understanding of gender. What is it that influences our understanding of what gender is? So I'm going to just go through a quick list here. You probably had some of these on your list, maybe not all of them. But certainly you should be able to see how these things have had impact. First one, no surprise, advertising. Just watch any set of adverts and you'll soon see that there are certain gendered ideas of gender norms espoused. What's interesting about this particular aspect, though, of course, is that in the past year or so, it has become against advertising standards authority practice. In other words, against the rules of advertising to reinforce negative gender stereotypes. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen entirely, and obviously when we look at some of the other feminist theories that we're going to discuss, such as Bell Hooks and Van Zunen, we can certainly find that sexist advertising still exists, sexist towards both men and women. But advertising is still a key way in which we understand perhaps gender norms. Politics might seem like a strange one, but of course politics has an influence on everything over our lives, whether that's the laws that are made and changed, reflecting maybe attitudes towards gender, such as the Sexual Discrimination Act, or perhaps even changes to a benefits system which is unfairly benefits one gender over another. Politics has always had an impact on our understanding and the relationship between men and women. TV is another one, similar to advertising. TV drama, TV sitcom has certainly helped us understand what gender means as we look to TV for role models, or we look for TV to represent the real world to us. Of course, in understanding that real world, or that constructed real world, informs our understanding of what it means to be male or female, feminine or masculine. Religion is another perhaps obvious one. Certainly, if you gave an answer in the previous question about the differences between femininity and masculinity changing from society to society, you may have discussed some religions which have incredibly strict views on how, usually women behave in society, what their role is in society. But equally, this has an impact on the role of men as well, and what they should do for often their families, or their role within a culture or a society as well, can often be based on religion. We can look to religions such as Islam and certain sections of Islam which require face coverings and specific clothing for women, but also look at the roles of men in perhaps the Catholic faith, whereby only men can fulfill the kind of top positions in that religion, and so on and so forth. So religion maybe has less of an impact in our everyday lives than it once did, but certainly has a shaping of how some people understand gender. Of course, you and I, just the people you have conversations with, the roles we have in different societies and different institutions, our roles within an educational setting or in our work setting. And of course that leads us on to talk about friends. We learn so much and we understand so much of the world through our friends that they have to have an impact. Maybe less so magazines these days, as they have a less impact in certainly a demographic such as yours. But we can't ignore the fact that magazines have been a key part of shaping our understandings of gender throughout the 20th century, really, and into the 21st. Our family will have had a big impact as well. You've got to think about the fact that so much of what you understand about the world comes from your family, even if you're rebelling against it. Certainly we get an idea of what masculinity and femininity is from watching our parents and our siblings. And again, like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have agreed and conformed to those things, but it will certainly have taught you something about what these roles are. Other answers you might have included were school and education. A lot of students mention the very strict uniforms that they had to wear as kids. And certainly if we go back a little bit further, I remember a time in my own schooling, which wasn't too long ago, whereby when we did PE, girls very strictly played hockey and netball, and the boys always played football and rugby. And whilst those changes may have happened over the years in education, still something has an impact. Of course, what we're talking about here, if you remember sessions on representations and Stuart Hall, we're talking about hegemony. Hegemony is those reinforced ideas that become the norm, that shape our understanding of the world and makes it become a sort of common sense, if you like, a set of implied values that are taken for granted. So this won't be anything too shocking or controversial. I'm just going to share a quick flowchart that really describes how we see gender at the moment, a sort of traditional view of gender, if you like, through the years, whilst this is obviously shifting. But a traditional view of gender would look something like this. You have a fixed sex. You are born either male or female based on the biological characteristics, shall we say, that you have. Being born male or female, as soon as it's yelled in that delivery suite, it's a boy or it's a girl, culture will immediately build a stable gender around you. I mentioned your family having an impact on that. Being a father myself, I know that some well-meaning, perhaps, should we say, elderly relatives immediately bought my little girl as many pink things as absolutely possible, knowing that it was a girl. And I'm sure the similar things happen with boys when they get bought all kinds of blue items of clothing. But that carries on through family and toys and advertising as well. Okay, so this is where your gender is built around that knowledge of whether you are male or female, and society builds that around you. What we move on to, though, is that as your gender is built around you, whether you are determined to be a masculine or feminine, this also traditionally determines your desire. So it's assumed that if you have a masculine identity, that you will desire people who are feminine. If you are feminine, have a feminine identity, you will desire someone who is masculine, which is why the kind of assumed norm is that men will be attracted to women and women will be attracted to men. Now, if we look at the media's role in this traditional approach to gender, we can see that obviously it comes in neatly in the middle part of this flowchart. In the past, an adherence to these traditional ideologies in the media has resulted in a kind of very limited representation of men and women, arguably a very sexist one as well. But it also means that if we take this as our traditional approach to gender, we've ended up with a very limited and underrepresented representation of the LGBT community, which is also often very stereotyped. And this is the reason why Judith Butler devised her queer theory. Queer theory is an approach to sexuality and identity, not just one or the other. Her book, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, arrived in 1990. So we're talking about 30 years ago now, when her theory was much needed because of aforementioned sexism, underrepresentation and misrepresentation. Her arguments introduced ideas about gender and identity which weren't in any way, shape or form the mainstream at the time. And just here are some of the points that she makes. She says that gender is a performance. Although it's not always a consciously chosen one, it is something that we perform. She says that the divide between masculinity and femininity is a social construction built around the divide between men and women. So we might describe this divide as binary, as often a traditional approach to gender is considered to be one thing or another, either male or female. But her main point was this: if we were able to spread a variety of non-traditional images, if we could spread a variety of ideas about how people can behave and act that are away from this norm, then actually the mass media can play a part in shattering the moulds of male and female roles. In other words, the media can play its part in altering these socially constructed ideas of masculinity and femininity. Well, this was written 30 years ago, so how well has that gone? I mean, the media may not have shattered gender roles, but there are certainly much more of a diverse approach to representation regarding gender than there were 25 years ago, shall we say. So what I'd like to do is to see if you can think of celebrities or other media texts and products which might be considered non-traditional in their representations of gender. Okay, so we're looking for non-traditional representation of gender. The flowchart I had up before, can you think of representations of celebrities or texts that break from that? Now, quick caveat or a quick word of warning. Just because someone is homosexual doesn't make them an example of this, okay? Louis Spence, for example, is a kind of, I suppose, a quite noted mainstream celebrity of the past 10 years. And whilst he's, very talented and entertaining, I would argue that he reinforces many old stereotypes of homosexuality. So we're not just picking anybody who is gay that reinforces traditional stereotypes. What we're looking for are people that maybe break down gender roles or notions of gender and sexuality. So, a few that you may have thought of and some that you possibly haven't, all can add to this. Okay, so rock star Marilyn Manson, okay, famously played with ideas of gender and challenged stereotypical notions of gender. The TV talk show host Ellen DeGeneres and her wife Portia de Rossi. The artist Grayson Perry, as well as the performer Lady Gaga, has inhabited a number of different personas, again experimenting with ideas of gender. Singer-songwriter Sam Smith, who recently came out as non-binary, and there's been a lot of discussion about how they are represented and addressed within the media. The actress and model Ruby Rose. The celebrity blogger and podcaster Jonathan Van Ness, and going way back to the 1960s and 70s, David Bowie, who was, I suppose, a kind of marker in the sand for non-traditional representations of gender and in an alternative culture. What I'd be interested to know is how many of these examples and how many of the examples that you came up with would you say are part of a mainstream media? So I'll provide you with a couple of examples of potentially examples of queer theory in mainstream media. The first one is an example of a celebrity and writer called Jack Monroe. Jack Monroe is a successful blogger, writer, and a political campaigner on a number of different issues. They started off writing cookbooks, and in particular a cookbook called Living on a Bootstrap, which reflected the poverty that Jack experienced with their child after Jack left the fire service during the era of austerity, and was having to make ends meet by sort of cooking meals as cheaply as possible. They, at that time, they wrote and blogged under the pseudonym A Girl Called Jack, and the books inspired other sort of lone parents throughout the recession to be able to kind of make ends meet as well. Now, Jack Monroe was born female, and in October 2015 came out as non-binary transgender, which essentially means that they don't identify as either male or female. In fact, this has been part of the debate over her representation. And whilst Jack is happy for the media to use typically feminine pronouns or female pronouns such as her, she, etc., a row erupted a few years ago when one of the maybe more mainstream newspapers insisted on using her birth name, which isn't Jack Monroe, as a means of undermining her wishes. Jack's success and celebrity continues to grow in the mainstream media. For a while, they were the face of a Sainsbury's ad campaign. And I think this is kind of indicative of how attitudes, perhaps in mainstream media, has changed, even though some media outlets still continue to maybe try and drive their audience to conform to more traditional notions of gender. If you're wondering who that mainstream newspaper was, you might not be surprised to find it was the Daily Mail. So Jack Monroe is one case study of a celebrity, I guess, but for a second case study, we're going to look actually much more at a media product itself, and one that might be surprising to consider as an example of queer theory, simply because it is possibly the most mainstream and most widely used media product on the planet, and that is Facebook. As one of the most used social media websites ever, and most powerful media institutions ever, Facebook's decision in recent years to give their users freedom of how they display their gender outside of the binary choices of male and female is really a significant ideological shift in mainstream media, and it may continue to break down simplistic and negative media stereotypes of homosexuality. So this started originally when they gave a number of different options for users to identify. I think initially there was sort of 72 different options for gender, and then to make things a lot simpler, they simply allow you to fill in the gender field yourself as to how you identify when you sign up for Facebook, and then allow you to decide which pronouns you would rather be referred to by those who you're friends with. They made a statement about this in 2015 that was quite clear. And as I said, this may seem like something that is becoming more normalised in different types of media, but you can't underestimate what an impact this would have had for something as mainstream as Facebook to have made that decision. So the things that Judith Butler were writing about 30 years ago maybe are shifting, maybe are changing into the way that she suggested. So just to kind of recap on her queer theory, in the way that we do with these theoretical framework, to reduce the work of a writer down to a few simple paragraphs, but hopefully these will be easy enough for you to remember and apply to other media. So first of all, queer theory is the idea that identity is performatively constructed by the expressions that are said to be its results. In other words, the gender identity is a performative expression manufactured through a set of acts. Slightly a trickier element to get your head around perhaps is the idea that there is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. Butler is quite clear that she believes this performative element to actually be all that is there, rather than a clear identity of gender below. And she says finally that the idea that performativity is not a singular act, but repetition and ritual. In other words, it's something that is continually added to. Now, on the surface, these things might seem a little bit complex. Certainly that idea of the difference between performative and performance. So here's Butler herself to explain some of these ideas in a little bit more detail.
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying gender is performative. When we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role, we're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different, because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And she was looking to harass me. Or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead I just turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality, or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim. Think about how difficult it is for sissy boys, or how difficult it is for tomboys to function socially without being bullied, or without being teased, or without sometimes suffering threats of violence, or without their parents intervening to say, maybe you need a psychiatrist, or why can't you be normal? So, there are institutional powers like psychiatric normalization, and there are informal kinds of practices like bullying, which try to keep us in our gendered place. There's a real question for me about how such gender norms get established and policed, and what the best way is to disrupt them and to overcome the police function. It's my view that gender is culturally formed, but it's also a domain of agency or freedom. It's most important to resist the violence that is imposed by ideal gender norms, especially against those who are gender different, who are non-conforming in their gender presentation.
So clearly some of the ideas that Butler puts forward are controversial. They're not things that everyone agrees with, but they are a theory as to how we should look at gender in society, but more importantly for us in media studies, how we can look at gender through the representations we see. And so, of course, what we're looking for mostly is how certain representations conform to gender norms and expectations, or traditional representations, should we say, and how some representations are part of a dismantling and a breaking down of gender norms. And so really this is where, to finish off, we can set ourselves a couple of tasks. First one is to find examples from across a range of different types of media, texts which reinforce traditional gender norms and gender roles, conform and play up to the stereotypes that we might expect. And of course the second task would be to look for media texts and products which challenge those traditional expectations of gender and present to us alternative ideologies. Now the interesting thing about this, that as time and society shifts, we will find that's constantly fluid as well, that itself is moving alternative ideas. So take some time to find examples of these, use your own experience in the media first, and then keep searching for types of media products which maybe are slightly outside of your comfort zone, outside of the types of media you usually consume as well. All of these things can be found with just a bit of research. And that's Judith Butler's queer theory.